Next week, it will be 15 years since I moved to Australia. I remember that flight. I'd been so busy with the rush of planning, preparation, selling one of my houses and renting out the other one, saying goodbye to family and friends. Actually, my brother and his wife got married the day before the flight, so it was busy, busy, busy. I just didn't have time to stop and reflect. I remember being on that plane. I was flying on my own. It was dark. I was in a window seat, and we'd just crossed the Australian coastline near Broome, so still 5 hours of flying to go. But I was wide awake because of the time difference. Because I was in the window seat, I pulled up the blinds, and because it was pitch black outside, that didn't wake up the plane and upset anybody. And so I was just looking out the window to see what I could see, and I could see the night sky. I could see the stars and didn't really recognize them. I wasn't really familiar with the Australian skyline. But I started to talk to God in that moment. I said, God, what am I doing? Where am I going? Is this right? Am I doing the right thing? Is this where I'm supposed to be? Who are you, God? What do you want for my life? Is this right? I'm on this journey. Am I following you? Am I just going in my own direction? And then I looked out the window again and I saw it straight in front of me, the Southern Cross. You can't see that from the UK. It's such a symbol of Australia. And there it was, framed perfectly in my little aeroplane window. I felt really strongly like it was God saying, yes, you're supposed to be here. When I think about that journey that I made all those years ago, I'm reminded a little bit about where we are in our story today. Exodus. Exodus is a journey too. It's obviously not from the UK to Australia, but from Egypt to the promised land of Israel. Now, I'm not sure if you could join us last night, but I hope you could. We looked very briefly at the first 12 chapters of Exodus there. That's the slavery in Egypt and the escape and the first Passover. And today we continue our story into the book of Exodus as we continue our series that we're in on the whole story of the whole Bible. Now, obviously, there's so much in the book of Exodus that, I could build out an awful lot of things from this book. But as Jared mentioned last week, there are big gaps of time in the Bible. So if you were to read Genesis and you were to close Genesis and then turn over the page and open it at Exodus, there's 400 years that have just vanished, and we don't know anything about what happened in that time, except obviously when we come across the people, they're in slavery. And so we can make some assumptions, but we're not specifically told. And so, I'm just trying to think, how would I feel if, God hadn't spoken to anybody that I knew for over 400 years? Sometimes we look at our own church history and our church is less than 200 years old. And sometimes we think those founding people who had those visions of God is so far away. How can they possibly be relevant in today's culture? Well, they had double that, 400 years. And so these people, they'd not really seen God in a long time. Well, God got them out of Egypt. They managed to escape through the Red Sea. Hopefully you can see a map there. They get to Sinai. They go from the top there, and then they come down and they get to Mount Sinai by chapter 19, and they stop. And they're there actually at the foot of Mount Sinai for the rest of the book. That's roughly around 310 kilometers. Scholars think it would have taken them about 47 days. So if you can think about that, obviously you could walk 310 kilometers faster than that if you just got on with it. But the Bible tells us clearly there's thousands and thousands of people. There's old people, there's young people, there's husbands and wives, there's children, they've got cattle and donkeys and sheep. And so moving through this whole people group, that would have been quite a challenge for them. And so here in Mount Sinai, God is reintroducing himself to his people. He's slowly teaching them again to trust him by showing his provisions again and again and again. One thing I've noticed as I read these stories is that the people start breaking this covenant. They start breaking the commitment that they've made to God. But yet it's God, the one that comes to them, and he makes even more promises to them as he renews his covenant. God just never gives up on his people. Leading up to Mount Sinai, God provides them manna. He provides them water where they can't get any water. And then, well, what do you think happens in Mount Sinai? Well, you might go, well, hang on, it's the laws, isn't it? It's just the laws. It's the boring bit. God just gives them a whole bunch of rules. Well, we hear the word law, and we in our culture, we have some quite strict connotations about the concept of law. Law in our society is very black and white. You know, you're either in the right or you're in the wrong, and you know, you follow the law and it fits in a little box. Well, the Hebrew word for law it doesn't quite have that same connotation. You might have heard the word before in Hebrew for law, it's the word Torah. And Torah also means teaching or instruction. Now, I know in our Burwood group we have a few teachers, and I'm sure that if you're standing teaching a class, maybe over Zoom, as you're doing at the moment, you're not just giving them laws, you're teaching them to think, you're teaching them, you're not just saying memorize the rules, you're giving them guidance that helps them to learn and grow, and you're helping them to become the people that they're going to be. And so I'd like you to think about this concept of law in that sense of teaching or guidance. I don't believe that the laws in the book of Exodus are all about just this is the box you need to fit in. This is God giving the people teaching and guidance that we can continue to learn from. And also, since this is the 10,000-foot view of the story, we don't have time to go into every single part of these laws, but I do want to focus on the most quoted verse from all of these laws or teachings in the book of Exodus. Actually, it is the most quoted verse in the whole Bible. Now, what I mean by when I say quoted is one of the features of biblical writing is that they often quote from other biblical books. For example, Jesus often says, "It is written," and then he quotes something that has been written in the Bible before. And it happens a lot both in the Old and the New Testament where they refer to other passages that have come before. Now, if someone were to ask you what is the most quotable verse in the Bible, what would you say? Well, probably in our Western context, we would say John 3:16. It's probably the most well-known verse. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever should believe in him will not perish but have everlasting life. Well, why is this verse so quotable? Well, because it sums up the whole story of salvation in a single verse, and it is a great verse. But if you were to ask any person in Jesus' lifetime before the New Testament was written, they would say, oh, the most quotable verse is the Old Testament verse found in Exodus that we're going to look at today. It's found in Exodus chapter 34 and verse 6 and 7. And these verses are repeated at least 27 times in the scriptures. So let's have a read of them, and then we'll have a look at some of the other places that they're used in the Bible too to help us get some context and to understand them a little bit more. Okay, so Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 and 7. And he passed in front of Moses proclaiming, the Lord, compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sins of the parents to the third and the fourth generation. The first thing you'll notice is that there's a tension in this passage. I've actually come across this passage before, and I've wished that I could kind of cut the end off. I've wanted to start with the lovely bit at the beginning, the compassionate, gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. Oh, let's just stop reading there, shall we? Because there is a tension here between God's loving kindness and God's justice. And we are going to dig into that tension a bit more in the discussion groups today. But I do want to say a few brief things quickly about this balance between God's goodness and love with his justice. Firstly, let's look at verse 7. Okay, so the verse 7 starts with showing love to thousands, maintaining love to thousands. Well, in the original Hebrew, it actually says maintaining love to the thousandth. And then at the end, where it says to the third, it says to the third and the fourth. So actually, the word generation doesn't appear anywhere in this passage. It's just, it doesn't make sense for us to say punishing to the third and the fourth and then just stop there. But actually, the way that it's written, it clearly says maintaining love to thousands. Some translations actually add of generations, but then punishing to the third and the fourth generation there. So it makes more sense if you start thinking about that in that context. The idea that God's saying, I will love your generation, the next generation, the next generation, the next, all the way up to 1,000 generations, but I'll only punish to a few. The idea of the third and the fourth, it's actually a Hebrew idiom. It's a common Hebrew expression. It doesn't literally mean 3 or 4. Another example where it shows in the Bible where it's talking about just a handful. Proverbs 30 verses 8 and 9 says, "There are 3 things that are too amazing for me, 4 things I do not understand. The way of an eagle in the sky, the way of a snake on a rock, the way of a ship on the high seas, the way of a man with a young woman." So it doesn't just mean 3 or 4. It means a couple, a few, or a handful. I'll show love to the 1,000th generation, and I'll punish just a few. It should strike you as you read that this is not an equal balance. It's definitely that God errs on the side of love compared to on the side of justice. Secondly, and just really briefly, Moses uses these words back to God in Numbers chapter 14. Here the people have sinned and God is angry with them. And Moses quotes Exodus 34, 6 and 7. It's actually the first time that it's re-quoted in the Bible back to God. And he reminds God of what he says. And he says, "You're a God that loves to thousands, but you punish to the third and the fourth. So please forgive them." And Numbers 14 verse 20 is a wonderful verse. God replies, "I will forgive them as you have asked." I think it's important to mention that. You would think if Moses is saying, "You're a God that loves 1,000, but you punish to the third and the fourth," you'd think that Moses is saying, so you're probably going to punish them a bit. But actually, Moses sees this as this scales of God that loves the thousands, but punishes just a little bit. Please forgive them. And God says he'll forgive them. I think it's important that I comment on that because this text is not saying that there's an intergenerational curse, that God curses innocent children. If God has a weakness, it's a weakness to forgive sins. It's God's soft spot. God, you can almost picture him like a doting old granddad where he says, "Oh, well, you don't deserve forgiveness, but because you've asked nicely, I forgive you." Then we're going to discuss this more in the discussion groups afterwards. So please join a discussion group and let's look more in that balance of God's justice versus God's love. Let's go back to the first part of this text. It's such a beautiful text. The Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in love and faithfulness. There is so much in this text. Quickly, I'll just put this into context for you. We've seen God act so far, so we can draw conclusions from his character, from his actions. But nowhere before in the Bible has anyone said to God, "Who are you?" But at the end of chapter 33, Moses actually asks, "God, tell me who you are. Show me your glory." And here is the words that God uses to describe himself. In preparation for this, I actually came across a podcast with 2 PhD theologians and someone like managing the conversation, the 3 of them discussing just these 2 verses and more than 14 hours of podcasts digging into, the character of God as shown in these verses. There's so much in here. Don't worry, I'm not going to preach for 14 hours for you today. But what I do want to leave you with is this incredible insight into the very first word that God chooses to describe himself with. Your version might have the word compassionate. Some older versions translate it as merciful. The Hebrew word is the word rachem. I'm going to give you 3 facts about this word rachem. Firstly, it's an emotional word. Sometimes we think of God as not having emotions. Actually, the idea that emotions are bad is a Greek philosophical idea that, the real you is tough and strong and that emotions are something that we should be able to control or to put aside or that are somehow separate from you. But that isn't the Hebrew picture of a person at all. God is absolutely an emotional character. Some examples just from looking at the character of Jesus. One of the most famous verses in the Bible is when Jesus is there at Lazarus's tomb and the Bible says Jesus wept. God showing emotion. God is grieved, the Bible says, at the story of the flood. He's grieved that he has to destroy, that he has to allow the flood to come and destroy the people. One of my favorite verses that talk about God's emotion is Hosea chapter 11, verse 8. here he's talking about the fact that Israel has sinned again and that punishment is going to come. And he's saying, woe to you, Israel, bad things are going to happen. But then God interrupts himself. He cuts himself off in saying punishment will come. And he says, how can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I hand you over? My heart is changed within me and all my compassion is aroused. It's not an emotionless word. God is passionate in his love for you. Zechariah 2 verse 8 says, he who touches you touches the apple of his eye. It's a very personal God that we have that cares massively about his love for you. His love for you is compassionate. It's emotional. God feels real emotion towards you. And it's the first word that he uses to describe his character. Second quick fact, it's a feminine word. Now, please don't write into the conference president to complain about me. I'm not saying that God is a woman, but I am saying that we were made in the image of God, male and female. So of course God would have characteristics from both our genders. The word racham comes from the Hebrew word womb. So actually you could think about it translating very literally as womb-like or womby. Now, of course, we wouldn't say that in English, but it's a very visceral image of the connection that a mother would have with the newborn baby, or even the baby as it's growing in her womb. Now, this is the way that God describes himself, having this connection with humanity in the same way that a mother. Think about some of the other texts in the Bible that actually uses the word racham too in describing God. It's the same word where God describes himself as a mother hen gathering her chicks under her wings. It's also the word that's used in Isaiah 49 verse 14 and 15, which says, can a woman forget her nursing child and have no compassion? That's the word racham again, on the son of her womb. Then the verse goes on, even these may forget, but I will not forget you. Now, I'm personally not a parent, but I have a lot of friends who have had the privilege of having children, and I've discussed this with my own parents as well. And they tell me that the connection that they have with their children is like nothing else that they've experienced. That they would absolutely lie down in traffic for this child, that they would do absolutely anything to give that child everything that they could. That's that compassionate love that the word racham is getting at. So it's an emotional word, it's a feminine word. And my third quick fact about the word racham is it's not just a feeling. The word racham is always connected to some form of action. It's also deeply connected to specific actions of forgiveness and rescue. So here's a couple of examples where you get this word showing up in the Bible. Psalm chapter 51 verse 1, after David has sinned and he cries out this psalm of forgiveness. And he says there, according to the greatness of your compassion, your racham, this is Psalm 51 verse 1, blot out my sins. So he's not just saying, just forgive me, God. He's saying, because of your racham, because of your great passionate love for me, God, blot out my sins. So David understands intrinsically that this connection between this love will lead God to action. Another example is Isaiah 55 verse 7. Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts, and let him return to the Lord, and the Lord will have compassion, racham, on him, for he will abundantly pardon. That's Isaiah 55. God's racham, his compassion, always leads to deliverance. And of course, it's God's racham, his compassionate, emotional, motherly love, that brought Jesus to earth as the ultimate act of our deliverance. I started off by mentioning that the book of Exodus is a journey. And while Exodus is a literal journey from Egypt to Canaan, we're all on a symbolic journey today. Just like the children of Israel, we doubt, we fail, we question, we stare out of windows at the night sky and we wonder, is this the way? Have you ever asked God, who are you, God? Then this is the verse for you. Who is this God? This is a God who loves you passionately. He loves you like a mother loves her child. And his love stirs him to action, to forgive, to rescue and restore. All you have to do is ask. I encourage you to connect with this God today.